Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to give you an update as to what's happening with the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, the Nord Stream pipelines, as I'm sure you'll be aware, were the biggest pipelines ever constructed in the world. They went under the Baltic Sea and provided gas directly from Russia to Germany, and Germany was actually Russia's biggest customer in terms of purchasing natural gas. That pipeline provided around 60 billion cubic meters of gas every single year, and Germany was paying over $10 billion a year to Russia in exchange for that. Now, as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Germany and Russia actually had a disagreement about the supply of gas, and Russia cut off all of those supplies. So the pipelines had stopped operating by the summer of 2022. And in September of that year, explosions took place under the water, which ruptured the pipelines and released around 200,000 tons of methane into the atmosphere. Now, in terms of how those explosions actually occurred, who was behind them, there have been a number of investigations since that time undertaken by Germany, Sweden and Denmark, because the explosions took place in Swedish and Danish waters. And in the latest development in this story, the Swiss company that owns the pipelines, NORDSTREAM AG, has now decided to sue the insurers for non-payment on the insurance policies that protected those pipelines. And interestingly, the controlling interest of NORDSTREAM AG is held by Russia. So in today's video, we'll go through the details of this latest action that's been taken by Russia against the insurance companies. We'll then talk about the insurance policies that are provided for the Nord Stream pipelines and what the insurers are saying in terms of the coverage and why they're not paying out on these claims. We'll have a look at the investigations that have been undertaken by Germany, Sweden and Denmark. I'll give you an update on where they are and what they think is the most likely reason behind these explosions. We'll then talk about the latest theories as to who actually was behind these explosions. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think the likely outcome of this court case will be and what's going to happen to the Nord Stream pipelines as we move forward. But before we get started on all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you so much for the time and effort that you've made to do that. Really appreciate it. And if you've signed up as either a patron or a member through Buy Me a Coffee, thank you for that. I really appreciate your long-term support. It helps me to keep the channel going and posting more videos. The idea to build the Nord Stream pipeline was first tabled back in 1997, and the construction actually took 14 years to come to fruition at a total cost of $8 billion. And this was a joint venture between Russia, Germany, France and the Netherlands. And this chart shows the ownership breakdown of the company that owns the Nord Stream pipelines, which is called NORDSTREAM AG and is a Switzerland-based company. And as you can see, 51% of the company, so a controlling stake, is held by Gazprom, the Russian gas business. 31% is held by two German energy companies, Wintershall and E.ON. 9% is owned by the French energy company Energy, and the remaining 9% is held by the Dutch energy company Nederland Gassenie. And the reason that this ownership structure is important is that by holding 51%, Gazprom has a controlling stake and therefore can make decisions on behalf of the company. And Gazprom and the company have now decided to sue the insurers for non-payment of their claims for the damages to the pipelines that took place in September 2022 when the explosions occurred. Nord Stream is seeking more than 400 million euros, or around $436 million, from its insurers relating to the explosions which ruptured the pipelines designed to transport Russian gas to Germany. NORDSTREAM AG has named Lloyd's Insurance Company and Arch Insurance DAC as defendants in its lawsuit, which was filed at London's High Court in February. Court filings state that Nord Stream's current preliminary estimate of the costs to dewater and stabilise the pipeline, to undertake a full repair and to replace the lost gas inventory is between 1.2 and 1.35 billion euros, so around $1.5 billion. Nord Stream's lawsuit says that the pipelines look mangled and deformed in one area where it has been damaged, but appeared smooth and to have been cut in another. Nord Stream in its lawsuit is suing all insurers subscribing to its offshore operating all risks policy, as well as its excess all risks policy. According to court documents, Nord Stream is suing Lloyd's on its own behalf and also as a representative of others subscribing to policies issued by insurers, including the German company Munich Re. So I think this is a really interesting development in this case. And once again here, we are seeing the real life implications of what's going on in terms of the war in Ukraine, because there are lots of different companies involved. There was obviously a company that owned the Nord Stream pipelines, NORDSTREAM AG, the Swiss company. And that company had to put insurance in place in the same way as you do with anything that you own. If you've got a building or a business or any form of infrastructure, you need to insure it against possible damage in the future. So NORDSTREAM AG obviously had insurance in place in the same way as you would have insurance for your house. And that insurance policy will have certain terms and conditions, and included in there will be exclusions. So if you've ever been involved in making an insurance claim, you'll know that the first thing that the insurance company wants to do is investigate the full circumstances as to what happened. And one of the reasons that they do that is to see whether or not there are any exclusions that apply to your claim, which means that they're not going to pay you out. Because one of the things insurance companies love to do is not pay people, to find some sort of loophole to say, actually, the reason that you're not covered is XYZ, which is all included in the very small print at the bottom of your policy. Now, the Nord Stream pipelines is obviously a major construction project, very complicated, and runs under the Baltic Sea. So I am sure that policy is highly comprehensive. It will run probably to hundreds of pages of documents, and there will be a very long list of exclusions. And most likely, the two main exclusions will be an act of war, which is quite a common exclusion. If something happens as a deliberate act of war, then insurance companies basically won't pay out against that. And also, there will be something relating to self-sabotage. If it's claimed that you caused the damage yourself deliberately, if you're doing it basically for an insurance claim to get the money back, then insurance companies generally don't pay out under that. And often that can be a criminal offence. So if it's found out that you're making a claim on your house insurance for a burglary, but the burglary never actually took place, you just set it up, you made it look like a burglary so that you could claim lots of money, then firstly, you won't get paid out by the insurance company, and secondly, you might get arrested. So in terms of assessing the claim made by Nord Stream AG for the damage to the Nord Stream pipelines, obviously the insurance companies will say, we need categoric proof of exactly what happened. If there were explosions, then who were behind those explosions? So basically, before they're prepared to pay out, the insurance companies will want to see the reports that have been produced as a result of the investigations being undertaken by Germany, Denmark and Sweden. So let's look at exactly where those investigations have got to. On the 7th of February 2024, Sweden's public prosecutor announced that the inquiry into the Nord Stream explosions had been formally closed after a 16-month investigation. Prosecutor Mats Lundqvist said the primary purpose of the investigation had been to find out if Swedes were involved or if Swedish territory had been used, and he concluded that Swedish jurisdiction did not apply, so basically Sweden have not made any comment whatsoever after 16 months of investigation as to who was behind these explosions. On the 26th of February 2024, Danish police announced that they were closing their inquiry into the Nord Stream blasts and concluded that although both Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 had been sabotaged in September 2022, there was no basis for pursuing a criminal case. Danish police said that the investigation, which was carried out with the Danish intelligence agency PET, had been complicated and extensive, and said it would not provide further comment on the case. So once again here we have an inconclusive conclusion to a 16-month investigation. So neither Denmark nor Sweden have come out and said what they believe happened to the Nord Stream pipelines, and the German investigation remains ongoing, and they haven't released any information at all so far. So in terms of categorically deciding who's behind this action, we're still no further forward. And obviously from the insurer's point of view, that leaves them in a position where they're unable to pay because they can't prove who did it, they can't prove who didn't do it, and therefore their exclusions may apply. And so obviously the insurance company is not paying out on the claim made by NORDSTREAM AG for its damages. And as a result of that, the company has decided to take the insurers to the High Court. So before we go on to talk about the potential outcome of that court case, let's look at a couple of theories as to who may have been behind these explosions. Russian ships able to perform underwater operations were present near to where the explosions took place on the Nord Stream pipelines, according to an investigative documentary from Norway. The potential for Russian involvement has emerged from details of suspicious Russian ship movements in the run-up to the Nord Stream blasts, reported by 4 Nordic public broadcasters and an accompanying English-language podcast of Cold Front. And Denmark's Defence Command confirmed a separate report that a Danish patrol boat called Nifem took 26 photos of a Russian submarine rescue ship in the area days before the explosions, with the submarine, which has the name SS-750, having sailed from Kaliningrad, which is part of Russia, close to the area of the explosions on the 22nd of September 2022. In addition to the submarine, it's also reported that Russian naval research vessel Sibiryakov, a tugboat named SB-123, and a third ship from the Russian naval fleet were also in the area, and all of these had their transmitters turned off and have therefore been referred to as ghost ships as it wasn't possible to track them. The first Russian vessel was reported to have left the port of Kaliningrad and arrived near the pipeline on the 7th of June. One radio message placed it directly above Nord Stream 2 before moving further north close to Nord Stream 1 pipelines and spending hours in the area where the pipeline runs around 260 feet below the surface and where some of the leaks would later occur. The vessel called Sibiryakov arrived in the area on the 14th of June and went to the same position as the first vessel, close to Nord Stream, and remained there until the next day. The Sibiryakov is believed to be capable of underwater surveillance and mapping, as well as launching a small underwater vessel. It can be used to support and rescue submarines and has the ability to carry out operations on the seabed, according to experts interviewed by the broadcasters. The movement of these vessels were tracked by a former British naval intelligence officer who worked on the interception of the Russian Baltic fleet until he retired in 2018. The anonymous officer said that he used open source information and radio communications to carry out his research. He says the pattern of radio communications in June indicated they were in an operational phase at some points. The tugboat called SB-123 sailed out to the area on the evening of the 21st of September. The broadcasters say that they intercepted communications that suggest it was operating close to the pipelines and the areas of the explosions from late that evening until around 1400 hours on the 22nd of September. According to the Washington Post, the US investigation agency, the CIA, learned in June 2022 of a Ukrainian plan to attack the Nord Stream pipelines 3 months before they were damaged by the underwater explosions.
The man in this picture is Colonel Roman Shavinsky. According to an exclusive from the Washington Post and Spiegel, he was central to the controversial bombing of the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines last year. Sources have painted a picture of him managing logistics for a 6-person team that rented a sailboat under false identities and dove deep into the Baltic Sea to plant explosive charges on the gas pipelines. They say he didn't act alone and that his orders ultimately came from senior military officials.
So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the fact that NORDSTREAM AG is bringing legal action against the insurers of the pipelines is really interesting. And once again here, it shows the real life implications of what's happening in Ukraine, because this is going to cost everybody ultimately. When you have large insurance claims, somebody has to pay for that. And ultimately, it will be you and me, because we have to pay for our car insurance and home insurance and other forms of insurance. And ultimately, the insurers make a profit. They will always make a profit in the long run. They may lose out in certain cases, but ultimately all that does is increase all of the premiums that we're paying, and so we will be footing the bill. And it's really interesting, I think, that Nord Stream AG are now suing the insurers, because as we've talked about in today's video, what we've got here is a case that hasn't been solved. Nobody really knows what happened to the Nord Stream pipelines. We've talked about a couple of theories in today's video. It might have been Russia. They certainly had the potential to break those pipelines. They either could have used the boats and the submarine that we talked about earlier in today's video, or even they could have used internal devices in the pipes themselves, because they have these robots called pigs that move up and down pipes to make sure that they're clear, to clean them. So theoretically, they could have attached some explosives to those pigs, sent them down underwater, and then detonated them. And obviously, it would be very difficult to prove that because there's no people involved. So it's difficult to track it. And we've also got a theory that Ukraine was behind the bombing of the pipelines. But when you take a step back and think about why somebody would want to bomb those pipelines, at that point in time, the pipelines were actually redundant. All of the gas had been switched off. Russia wasn't supplying any gas to Germany anymore. And from Germany's point of view, they certainly didn't want to buy any gas from Russia in the future. However, there were a lot of theories at the time that Germany could utilise the pipelines. They could actually cut off the end of them, so not take any supply from Russia, and then actually feed in some supplies, maybe from Norway or from LNG or from other sources. So there was still a potential that the pipes themselves could be used, not to buy Russian gas, but for other purposes. But in terms of why somebody would want to blow up the pipelines, well, at that point in time, Russia wasn't actually receiving any income. So from Ukraine's point of view, blowing up the pipeline wouldn't actually have achieved that much. It wouldn't have cut off any future income from Russia's point of view, because all of that income had stopped anyway. In terms of the damage potentially to the West and to Germany, there is a logic that says if Germany was thinking about using the pipelines, then Russia may have decided to blow up those pipelines to stop it doing that. But as I said, we don't have any categorical evidence, so there are no conclusions that anybody can work with. And what that means from the insurer's point of view is that they've got justification not to pay out on that claim, because they will need to be satisfied that all of the exclusions in their policy have been met, that none of them actually apply to this claim. And as we talked about earlier, two of the most common exclusions in these sort of policies are acts of war or self-sabotage. So the policyholder will need to prove that it wasn't an act of war, that it wasn't done by Germany or Ukraine or Russia as a result of what's happening in Ukraine. And also, it wasn't self-sabotage, that Nord Stream AG didn't decide to actually blow up the pipelines themselves so that they could receive a hefty payout. And that, of course, is another theory as to who could be behind these explosions. So in the absence of any conclusive report, the insurers are never going to pay. They're not going to give away money just for the sake of it. If you can't prove what happened, then that is an inconclusive case. So Nord Stream AG have decided to take this to the High Courts. And it's likely that the High Courts will make the same conclusion that we've made in this video. They'll look at the facts, and the fact that they can't provide categoric evidence as to what actually happens means that it's going to be very difficult for a judge to be able to give in favour of Nord Stream AG, because they just don't know who was behind these bombings. So I don't think it's very likely that Russia and Nord Stream AG will be successful in their High Court action. And I think what we're seeing here is another example of Russia causing as much trouble as possible. They're going to the courts because obviously they can do that under the claim it hasn't been paid out. So they can actually bring this action into the courts. But it's another example of Russia bringing things to the European courts when in Russia itself they're making decisions such as nationalising infrastructure that's important to Russia, that other companies overseas are losing the full value of. But Russia have decided that they can do that. But because all of the companies that operate in Europe and the West have to comply with the European rules and regulations and laws, Russia is still able to come to the courts, bring action against the insurers of the Nord Stream pipelines, and try to get some money out of them. And obviously there's going to be a lot of costs involved in this, because when you're defending High Court action, you need to hire a team of barristers. You'll have hundreds of lawyers working on this, putting together your case. This case is likely to use up hundreds and potentially thousands of hours of time, which will all be billable. So somebody will do well out of this. All of the lawyers will do very well. But ultimately, somebody's going to have to pay for it. It's likely that the insurance companies will have to pay their own costs. And as I said, that means that they'll have higher costs and they'll have to pass that through to you and me through higher premiums. So the overall summary of today's video is that I think it's really interesting that NORDSTREAM AG has brought legal action against the insurers for the non-payment of the claim. I don't really think that they've got a solid case. I don't think it's likely that they'll win that case. And ultimately what we're seeing here is Russia bringing more court action against Western companies that's going to waste a lot of time and money. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.